Do you know what this is? That's right, it's an egg. Each animal's eggs will have different sizes and hatching times. So do you know which animals lay eggs? Okay, today let's find out. Are you ready? Let's go! Birds are perhaps the most famous egg-laying animals. They lay their eggs in the nest, which are usually incubated by one or both parents until they hatch. Eggs have a hard shell to protect the developing embryo. Normally, the average time for a bird's egg to hatch is from 12 to 35 days on average, and the average incubation time can vary depending on many factors such as environmental temperature, humidity, and the specific bird species. Reptiles. Reptiles such as turtles, snakes, lizards, and crocodilians are oviparous. They lay eggs on land or in water, depending on the species. Reptile eggs also have a protective shell. The time it takes reptile eggs to hatch also varies depending on the specific species. Here are some examples of incubation times for some common reptiles. Turtle. The time needed for turtle eggs to hatch can last from several weeks to several months, depending on the species and environmental conditions. For example, sea turtle eggs typically take 45 to 70 days to hatch. Snakes. The time it takes for snake eggs to hatch also varies depending on the species. Some snake species can hatch in a few weeks, while others can take several months. For example, the eggs of some common snakes such as grass snakes can take about 60 to 90 days to hatch. Lizard. Incubation time for lizard eggs also varies depending on the species. Some species may bloom in a few weeks, while others may take several months. Crocodile and squirrelfish. Crocodile and squirrelfish eggs usually take 70 to 90 days to hatch. This time may vary depending on environmental conditions. As such, the average time it takes for reptile eggs to hatch can vary significantly depending on the specific species and environmental conditions. Amphibians. Most amphibians, including frogs, toads, and salamanders, are oviparous. They lay eggs in water or moist environments, where the eggs undergo external fertilization and develop into tadpoles before metamorphosing into adults. The average time it takes for amphibian eggs to hatch is also quite diverse and depends on the specific species. Here are some examples. Frogs. Frog incubation periods usually range from a few days to a few weeks, depending on the species. For example, the eggs of some frog species can hatch in about 5 to 20 days after being laid. Bullfrogs. For bullfrogs, the time for eggs to hatch usually lasts from 7 to 21 days after being laid. This time can also vary depending on the species and environmental conditions. Salamanders. The incubation period of salamanders is also quite diverse. Can last from a few weeks to a few months depending on the species. Some salamanders may require one breeding season or even multiple seasons for their eggs to hatch. Frogs. The incubation period of frogs usually ranges from a few days to a few weeks, depending on the species and environmental conditions. Thus, the time it takes for amphibian eggs to hatch also varies greatly depending on the specific species and various environmental factors. Fish. Many species of fish are oviparous. They lay eggs in water, where fertilization typically occurs externally. Some fish lay adhesive eggs that stick to surfaces, while others release eggs into the water column. The average time it takes for fish eggs to hatch also depends on the specific species. Here are some examples. Goldfish. Carassius horatus goldfish eggs usually take about 2 to 7 days to hatch after being laid. This time depends on the water temperature and environmental conditions. Herring. Cyprinus carpio herring eggs also take about 2 to 7 days to hatch, depending on temperature and environmental conditions. Salmon. Salmon are migratory fish, and their incubation period depends on the type of fish: red, pink, chum, sockeye, chinook, and coho, as well as on the spawning location. Egg. Normally, from the time the egg is laid until it hatches, it can last from a few weeks to a few months. Carp. Tilapia. The incubation period for carp eggs usually ranges from 2 to 5 days, but can be up to 7 to 10 days depending on the species and environmental conditions. Small colored fish. Danio. Zebrafish. Eggs of small colored fish usually take about 2 to 3 days to hatch after being laid. Thus, the time it takes for fish eggs to hatch can vary depending on the species, environmental temperature, and different living conditions. Invertebrates. Various invertebrates are also egg layers. This includes insects like butterflies, beetles, and ants, as well as mollusks like snails and clams. Invertebrate eggs vary widely in size, shape, and where they are deposited.